ministry. You will recognize the name, Cotton Mather. There is a lot of myth surrounding the man. He was influential in the infamous Salem witch trials and the introduction of vaccines with smallpox epidemic and all this fun. I'm giving your lecture, I'm sorry. I'm just whetting their appetite. He'll fill in the details. I only know bullet points. So part one will be this morning, and then part two will be this evening at 6 o'clock. And then Brother Phil will also be preaching God's word to us during our morning worship hour. But for those who were with us yesterday, we got a full introduction to Phil and who he is and the blessing that he has been to the church and how the Lord has used him. But for those who don't know Phil, just a brief introduction. He has been ministering at Grace to You for 39 years, which is the media ministry of John MacArthur. He serves as chief editor and operations director there at Grace to You. But what's at the heart of Phil is that he serves as a pastor elder at Grace Community Church. He pastors Grace Life Fellowship Group. I personally have been affected and have the imprint of Phil's ministry upon my soul, and I've been grateful to the Lord for Phil through the years and his taking a stance for theological truth. But this morning he's going to present part one with Cotton Mather, and I think he'll have some time for questions. He thinks he'll have time for questions. Who knows where the lecture goes, but he'll have some time for questions at the end of the seminar this morning. Phil.
All right, so our subject is Cotton Mather. In this hour, though, we're going to focus a little bit on his family background. He had at least three immediate ancestors who were also famous pastors in the Puritan era. Hang on a minute, my notes disappeared. I don't know how that happened. But anyway, he had, as I said, three immediate ancestors. His father and two of his grandfathers were famous pastors, very influential pastors. We'll talk about them and his family background mostly this morning. We'll talk a little bit about Cotton himself, and then this evening I want to survey his life and influence and tell you how all of these things came about. Darlene, did I leave my phone back there? I need to come and get it. Not that I need my phone, but this is one of those lecterns that's slanted, so my notes fall down into the gutter of it, and it makes it hard to read them. So if I put my phone under the iPad, it holds it up higher. Not that you needed that instruction, but I didn't want to just be quiet while I went and got my phone. I don't know what image Cotton Mather's name evokes in your mind, but the typical American has a totally false impression of who he was and what he was like. I think the most common view of Mather is that of a stern, imposing, sort of judgmental, perpetually frowning, legalistic magistrate in a robe with a furrowed brow, a mean guy who casts a long, dark shadow. I Googled Cotton Mather while I was getting my notes together for this lecture, and I was surprised to learn that Cotton Mather is a character in the Marvel universe of comic book heroes, villains actually. They draw him in a black pilgrim costume with a superhero type cape, and they give him a long, straight, scraggly white hair and a face that is not only always angry, in their version he's always baring his teeth. So they focus on the meanness of him. They try to make him look mean. The picture they draw of him doesn't look anything like him. The popular lore about him has, though, turned him into that kind of hateful caricature. History has been extraordinarily cruel to Cotton Mather, making him out to be this sort of one-dimensional, overbearing, opinionated, medieval mind with a mean-spirited attitude. He's portrayed as someone you wouldn't want to know, and you certainly wouldn't want to have in authority over you. And he was not like that at all. He himself was never as cruel as he is made out to be. There was an author named Worthington Ford, which is kind of funny if you've ever lived in California, because we have a car dealer named Cal Worthington. He's a Ford dealer. So Worthington Ford is a huge dealership. This guy, Cal Worthington, used to be on TV, and it would come on the commercial, and it would say, Cal Worthington and his dog Spot. And his dog Spot was always some zoo animal, like a tiger, or he'd have a llama or something. It was never his dog Spot, but that's Worthington Ford to a lot of people. There was actually a Puritan scholar named Worthington Chauncey Ford, who was a historian and an editor who specialized in early American history. And in 1911, he wrote the preface to the first printed edition of Cotton Mather's diary. And in it, he said this, quote, "In Mather will be found much to repel and little to attract. In the course of time, his earnestness becomes painful, his resignation and self-abasement ring hollow, his cries become strident, his postures and prayers seem mechanical." So he's portraying him not only as a mean person, but also as a big phony. And he further said of Mather, he took his religious observances as men take opium, suggesting he was addicted to the ceremony and pageantry of religion. It's true that there were some aspects of Cotton Mather's life and opinions that aren't really admirable. He had a tendency to be a self-promoter. He sometimes came across as kind of pompous and verbose. He might have been a little too fond of getting recognition, and he also might have been a little too concerned about what other people thought about him. It's clear that he waged a lifelong struggle with the sin of pride, but who doesn't struggle with that? He did keep a diary. I have a copy of it. It's an intensely personal and sometimes uncomfortably candid look into the man's heart. And you can't miss the fact as you read it that pride and a love of praise and recognition were kind of besetting sins for him. He wrote a lot and worried a lot about what people thought of him. And in spite of everything I like about him, it is obvious that he fought this lifelong battle against the spirit of Phariseeism. And he didn't always win, because he did do sometimes, like the Pharisees, his religion, so that men would see, to get the praise of men. Now, still, I know that this was a battle he consciously and constantly waged, because sometimes what you read in his diary is so self-abasing, he was prone to so much rigorous self-examination and unvarnished honesty about himself that you wish you could go back in time and give this guy some words of encouragement. That diary is one of the main reasons we know the faults of Cotton Mather so well. But if you read it with a modicum of understanding about the times and the circumstances in which he lived, and especially if you have any kind of sympathy for the faith that shaped his thinking, I think if you get to know the man, you will admire his discipline, his willingness to examine himself critically, and his desire to please God, which I think was sincere. He was, I believe, in every sense that it's possible for a fallen human being to be, he was a godly man. And it's fair to note, I think, that some of his critics have taken a harsher view of his diary than I do. One critic, writing from a modern rationalist perspective, way back in 1927, said this about him. He said, quote, "The diary of Cotton Mather is a treasure trove to the abnormal psychologist. The thing would be inconceivable if the record were not in print." He says, "What a crooked and diseased mind lay back of those eyes that were forever spying out occasions to magnify self. He grovels in proud self-abasement. His mind is clogged with the strangest miscellany of truth and marvel. He labors to acquire the possessions of a scholar, but he listens to old wives' tales with greedy avidity. He was earnest to do good. He labored to put into effect hundreds of good devices, but he walked always in his own shadow. His egoism blots out charity and even the divine mercy." Now, I don't agree with that assessment. I think it's a grossly unfair way to characterize Cotton Mather, and it overstates his flaws. He did have flaws, but we don't need to magnify those while refusing to acknowledge his virtues. The guy who wrote that is basically saying that even Mather's willingness to examine himself critically and be candid about his own failures and sins, even that, he says, was phony, self-aggrandizing. I don't believe that. I think Cotton Mather was nothing like the villain popular history has made him out to be. And in fact, the people who lived in and around him didn't think that either. He was a beloved pastor. He was known to be gentle in his dealings with people and parishioners. He wasn't a harsh person at all. He spent most of his life serving as an assistant pastor to his father. He wasn't even the senior pastor. His father was Increase Mather, who pastored the Second Church in Boston. And by the way, that's what the church was called at the time, the Second Church. The building was called the Old North Meeting House, and it's not the same place as the Old North Church that is made famous, in the poem about Paul Revere. The Old North Church was an Episcopal church. The Mathers Church was a Congregationalist church, and it was the largest church in Massachusetts. It was a very large church for the time, with 1,500 members listed in the early 1700s. And so, although Cotton Mather preached frequently and wrote prolifically, he was not the senior pastor of that church until his father died, and that was in 1723. Cotton Mather himself died just 5 years later. So out of all his life in ministry, he only spent 5 years, the last 5 years of his life, as a senior pastor. And yet, for most of his life, he was the most respected and most sought-after pastor in all of New England. Increase Mather, his father, was more of a scholar, but he wasn't a people person. And so it fell to Cotton to do most of the hands-on personal shepherding of the flock. He did all the visitation, the counseling, ministering to young people. He was known for his ability to organize groups, home groups, and doing one-on-one evangelism. And as a person, he was approachable and warm-hearted and, as I said, gentle in his dealings with people. So he was known as a kind and compassionate minister who gave generously of his time to other people. If you were in that church and you needed counsel, you would go see Cotton and not his father. Cotton truly loved the people in his flock. He understood the value of knowledge. He pursued wisdom. He earnestly sought to do what is right, and all of those virtues shine if you take an unprejudiced look at his life. Increase Mather, as I said, was a scholar and a more imposing personality. He was magisterial. He was an intellectual and an administrator. He had actually served as president of Harvard University while Cotton was a student there. And for the first decade of Cotton's work in the church, he was regarded the way you might expect the son of a great minister to be. Cotton might express an opinion, and the response of the people would be, we'll see what your father has to say about that. But Cotton quickly gained the people's respect, and before the first decade of his public ministry ended, his stature superseded that of practically every other pastor in Massachusetts, partly because he wrote so much, published so much, and preached so often. And it's a simple matter of fact that he was a truly learned man by the standards of that time. And he also had this genetic heritage that more or less guaranteed his fame and influence in early Massachusetts. His grandfathers, I mentioned, were also pastors and famous pastors. They were literally the two most important Puritan pastors in the founding generation of Massachusetts. Both of his grandfathers had come to the New World with the very earliest waves of pilgrims, and Cotton bore the names of both of his grandfathers. Richard Mather was his paternal grandfather. He came to the New World in 1635. That was 28 years before Cotton was born. So his family had lived in the New World for 28 years before Cotton Mather was even born. His maternal grandfather, John Cotton, had come to New England 2 years before that. John Cotton fled England because his life was literally in jeopardy because of his faith. He had come into the crosshairs of William Laud, who was the Bishop of London, who, if you know anything about that part of church history, Laud was a famous name. He was a hardcore Arminian and a high church Anglican who absolutely despised and constantly persecuted the Puritans. There's quite a bit of evidence in Bishop Laud's diary that he was a secret homosexual. He never married, and his diaries include vivid descriptions of these homoerotic dreams and other clues that he was struggling with a powerful same-sex attraction. And if you've ever read anything about the early Puritans, as I said, you already know who Laud is, and you know his reputation. One historian says of him, Laud was a humorless, dwarf-like figure who was never much liked, even by his allies. But he rose to the top office in Anglican Church the same year John Cotton arrived in the New World, and he was a merciless persecutor of the Puritans. Now, before he became the head of the Anglican Church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and while he was still just the Bishop of London, I say just, but that's an important office, he had summoned John Cotton to the High Court of the church to answer for the fact that he was a nonconformist. He didn't follow the Anglican prayer book and didn't yield to the hierarchy of the church in every detail of how they worshiped. And it's a long story that we really don't have time to cover, but John Cotton knew that he would pay with his life for his beliefs if he stayed in England, and that is what motivated him to go to the New World. He went to America when he was 47 years old, which by the standards of those days, that was already old. He was old. Too old to start over at age 47. The fact that John Cotton was singled out by Bishop Laud is a clue about how prominent John Cotton was. Cotton was an expert in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and several other languages. He had studied under Richard Sibbes, and he and Richard Sibbes were personal friends. They knew each other well. Another mentor and personal friend of his was William Perkins. William Perkins was one of the first great English Puritan theologians. And if you know anything at all about Puritan history, you'll recognize both of those names, William Perkins and Richard Sibbes. Both of them knew and admired John Cotton. I also have to mention John Owen. I know you know John Owen's name. He's probably the best known, most meticulous, most enduring, most influential of all of the classic Puritan theologians. And in 1644, which is more than a decade after John Cotton had come to the New World, John Cotton wrote a book on church polity, which was titled The Keys of the Kingdom of Heaven. It was a defense of Congregationalism against both Presbyterianism and Episcopalianism. So John Cotton was a Congregationalist, and his influence is what drove most New England churches to be Congregationalist churches as well. And his book reached England. John Owen acquired a copy because he said he wanted to refute it. He was more of a Presbyterian by conviction. And instead, when he read John Cotton's work on church polity, John Owen was converted to Congregationalism. So all that is to say, John Cotton was a supremely eminent theologian and pastor. If you could change the mind of John Owen, you're a pretty persuasive theologian. And he was renowned also for the quality of his preaching. The Puritan era was, in my judgment, the best chapter in all of church history. And John Cotton was one of the very best men of that era. 2 years ago, a friend of mine, Nate Pickowitz, you may have heard of him. He's He's all over the internet. Nate, who pastors a New England church today, edited and republished a classic biography titled John Cotton, Patriarch of New England, and he asked me to write a foreword to it. So here's my opening line from that foreword. Among the luminaries of the early Puritan era, none shines brighter than John Cotton. He possessed a remarkable array of spiritual gifts and academic accomplishments. He was a brilliant scholar, a master of the biblical languages, a skilled and perceptive theologian, a proficient writer, a powerful preacher, a tender-hearted pastor, a wise and sympathetic counselor, and an effective evangelist. And he was all of those things. Let me also add that John Cotton was the first church leader who was deservedly famous on both sides of the Atlantic. He was a genuinely remarkable man and a top-notch scholar, and it was he more than anyone who became the living embodiment of everything his grandson ever aspired to be. Cotton Mather spent most of his life trying to live up to the reputation of his grandfathers. And in fact, he had yet another famous and influential Puritan grandfather, Richard Mather. John Cotton and Richard Mather were like-minded Puritan ministers. They agreed on most doctrinal issues. Neither of them had separatist tendencies, but both of them were more or less forced to become separatists. They were cut off from the Anglican Church, and because they faced persecution when they refused to follow the high church Anglican practices, all the traditions that the Anglican Church had kept from Roman Catholicism. They despised all of that. They thought worship should be simple and not filled with all sorts of rituals, prayers to Mary, and all of that sort of thing. Those things still existed in mainstream Anglicanism. And in 1634, Richard Mather was ousted from his Anglican pulpit in Liverpool because the Bishop of York heard that he wasn't wearing a surplice. That's the liturgical vestment, the robe that Anglican priests wear and are supposed to wear, one of those knee-length Anglican robes. Puritans typically did refuse to wear priestly vestments, but the high church Anglicans loved anything that smacked of ceremonialism. So the Bishop of York was militantly opposed to any kind of nonconformity. Anybody who refused to follow the prayer book or wear the vestments ultimately got ousted from the Anglican Church in a purge that took place later in the 17th century. But Richard Mather was one of the early victims of that. He lost his pulpit over his nonconformity, and when others pleaded for Richard Mather's reinstatement to the pulpit, Mather himself, or rather the bishop who excommunicated him, famously said it would have been better for him if he had begotten 7 illegitimate children rather than refuse to wear the vestment. When John Cotton heard of Richard Mather's dilemma, he wrote and urged him to come to Massachusetts, join the colony here. And so Richard Mather and his family set sail in May of 1635, and they almost didn't make it. Just before they reached the coast of North America, they were hit with a storm that superseded anything anyone ever thought possible in New England. If you've ever seen that movie, The Perfect Storm, it was like that. It was a tropical hurricane known to history as the Great Colonial Hurricane of 1635. And this hurricane had followed the American coast north, and it hit the Mather's ship just off the coast where Portsmouth, New Hampshire is today, which is right by the border of New Hampshire and Maine, right on the border of those two states. And the ship that they were in was seriously damaged, but they managed to limp into Boston Harbor, and not one life was lost in the storm. Richard Mather accepted a call to be minister of a new church plant at Dorchester. That is about 5 miles south of downtown Boston today. It's part of greater Boston today. Then it was considered kind of a remote area, Dorchester. He remained as pastor of the church in Dorchester until his death in 1869. So for 34 years, he pastored a new church in New England. He was widowed twice. And here's a weird thing. His third marriage was to the widow of John Cotton. John Cotton had died in 1652, and his widow accepted a proposal for marriage to Richard Mather almost 4 years later. And that marriage lasted about 13 years until Richard Mather died in 1669. And it makes a very complicated family tree because it means that Cotton Mather's maternal grandmother was also both his paternal step-grandmother and his father's stepmother. Cotton Mather's father was Increase Mather. He was the third in this long line of deservedly famous New England pastors. Increase was the first one in the Mather line to be born in America. He was born there at Dorchester, near Boston, 4 years after Richard Mather arrived in the New World. And Increase graduated from Harvard at age 17. Here's an amazing thing. Harvard College was already more than 20 years old at the time. You really, most of us don't have any concept how old Harvard University is. After he graduated, Increase wanted to further his education, so he went to Ireland, where he earned a master's degree, and he also served as a minister in 2 Puritan churches there in Ireland for the next 4 years. That was the era of Oliver Cromwell, and Cromwell was trying by military means to make Ireland a Protestant nation. Not a good evangelistic strategy, by the way. For any of you who may be prone to theonomy, it didn't work for Cromwell, and it's actually never worked in church history. But Cromwell died suddenly in the fall of 1858, probably from blood poisoning following a urinary infection, and so there was no leader strong enough to step into the shoes of Oliver Cromwell. So by 1660, the royalists in England had restored the British monarchy, and Increase Mather returned to Massachusetts. And to be clear, he was in Ireland to further his education and to do pastoral work. He was not there to be involved with the politics of the situation or the military campaign of Cromwell and the Protectorate, but his position became less tenable once Cromwell and his party were out of power. So Increase returned to the New World, where he soon married Maria Cotton, which, remember, his father was married to her mother, so Maria was technically his stepsister. So, as I said, it's a weird family tree. They had grown to adulthood in different households, so this wasn't maybe as weird as it might sound. And especially in a tightly knit and sparsely populated community like colonial Boston, almost everybody was related in one way or another to everybody else. So unions like that weren't terribly unusual in the time. And Increase and Maria married in 1662, which is the year after he returned from Ireland. And their first child was Cotton Mather, born the following year, 1663. Cotton was the first prominent pastor in the New World who spent his entire life in New England. He never traveled abroad. His life straddled 2 conflicting eras, and this shaped his personality. You had old world customs and medieval thinking. These were fading. The age of enlightenment was about to dawn in just a few decades, and Mather had one foot planted firmly in each era. That is how he let medieval superstitions get out of control during the Witchcraft crisis, and yet at the same time he was so aware of and so interested in the scientific discoveries that were changing the world around him that he was personally responsible for a number of scientific advances and medical advances in New England. We'll talk more about that, and in fact, he wrote a medical textbook, which I'll share parts of it with you tonight. Very interesting. But his curiosity about scientific progress was really remarkable when you realize that in those days, there was no speedy or easy means of communication between the American colonies and the intellectual centers of Europe and Great Britain. And yet, Cotton Mather found a way to keep up. He was a voracious reader, and he would devour journals from the Royal Society, which is like England's twin to our National Geographic Society, right? They publish these journals with exciting information about everything from geography to the latest scientific discussions. And he read all of those, and he did his own research and experimentation on things, collecting and cataloging geographical information and botanical specimens and zoological notes and all kinds of other oddities from the New World, and he would send them back to England. George Lyman Kittredge, who was an early 20th century Harvard professor, said this, that Cotton Mather was one of the best informed Americans of his time in scientific matters. And that's an aspect of Cotton's character that we don't often hear about. He was, for his time, more scientifically knowledgeable and advanced than anyone else in his generation. And his letters to the Royal Society of London resulted in his being nominated as a member of the Royal Society. That still exists, by the way, the Royal Society. It's the most important academy of science in the English-speaking world. And as I said, it is to science what the National Geographic Society is to geography and culture. And Mather was one of its earliest members, if not the earliest member from the American colonies. Both Cotton Mather and his father had a keen interest in the workings of divine providence. This is where it ties into our theme for this weekend. I think it was Increase who sparked this interest in his son's thinking, but both of them devoted a great deal of time and energy to the task of making a written record of extraordinary events and oddities, some of them real, some of the, obviously the pilgrim equivalent of urban legends. They recorded a lot of these stories that you read and you go, nah, I don't think that really happened. But they heard about these things or personally observed, knew people who claimed they had personally observed these things and collected them in a book. The book was authored technically by Increase. Cotton helped him collect details for it. And this book on the subject of extraordinary providences was the first and most enduring. It's a catalog of unusual stories titled the way Puritans usually titled their books, with lots of words. Here is the title: An Essay for the Recording of Illustrious Providences, wherein an account is given of many remarkable and very memorable events which have happened this last age, especially in New England. The book was published in 1684, and this is a picture, is it up there? Yes, this is a picture from the first edition. It's a rare preserved copy of the very first printing of this book. This copy is owned by the Danvers Archival Center at the Peabody Institute Library in Salem, Massachusetts. If you go to that area of the country, and you want to see the history of the witchcraft trials, for example, it's not technically in Salem where the witchcraft thing happened. It was in Salem Village, which was a village further inland. Today that community is called Danvers. So if you want to see where the witchcraft trials, where the witchcraft episodes actually occurred, you have to go to Danvers, not Salem, but they're right next door to each other. And this book is in the Danvers Library, the archival center in Massachusetts. This was the first book ever published that chronicled some of the early stories about witchcraft in New England. This was published before the witchcraft outbreak that's famous. The infamous witchcraft episode in Salem occurred, I think, 8 years after this book was published. But most historians will point to this book, Increase Mather's book, as one of the sources that first aroused the fear of witchcraft in Salem Village. And in my judgment, all of that stuff would have probably happened anyway with or without this book. And I have to say definitively, I don't believe that either Increase or Cotton Mather had any kind of sinister fear-mongering motive, either when Increase Mather wrote this book or when Cotton wrote another volume a few years later, 1689. Cotton Mather's book was titled Memorable Providences, relating to witchcrafts and possessions. And his volume focused entirely on witchcraft and demonic possessions, and I think it's indisputable that Cotton's book on witchcraft had the unfortunate effect of generating a lot of fear and superstition and undue interest in the workings of the satanic world. And he stirred all that up rather than quelling it, but I don't think that was his aim. He was mainly wanting to relate how he personally had dealt with a difficult case and seen the Lord deliver a girl who seemed bewitched. We'll talk about that incident later tonight. But Cotton was trying, I think, to encourage readers and encourage them especially not to dabble in witchcraft, but also encourage them that the power of God's word has power to overcome the dominance of Satan. But instead, he, I think, inadvertently provoked an unhealthy curiosity about the powers of evil, particularly in the young people in that area. But both books, both Cotton's book and his father's book, reflect the interest both of these men had in the doctrine of divine providence, plus their special interest in remarkable providences, strange phenomena, odd and unusual circumstances, natural wonders, and all things extraordinary, like amazing coincidences and marvelous good fortune and all those sorts of things. In fact, I like to compare Increase Mather's essay for the recording of illustrious providences to say that this was the precursor that kind of paved the way for Ripley's Believe It or Not. It reads like that. Now remember, this was 1684. So history is nearing the end of the classical era, and the Age of Enlightenment is officially going to begin in just a few decades. So all of these projects, and particularly these two books, contained far too much medieval superstition to make them trustworthy guides for anyone who might be seeking doctrinal soundness or practical spiritual maturity. For example, they include lots of stories about ghosts and apparitions, and their treatment of witchcraft is much too laden with myths and delusions. And the book is arranged topically, with chapters on remarkable sea deliverances. One of the stories Increase chronicles is the story of his parents when they came to America, almost being destroyed by that hurricane. Another chapter on other remarkable preservations where people nearly lost their life, but they were somehow stunningly or miraculously saved from death. A chapter on remarkables about thunder and lightning, which I'll talk more about that in a minute. Things preternatural, this is where he relates stories of witchcraft in that chapter. Demons and possessed persons, another chapter that delves into things that are related to satanic possession and witchcraft. Apparitions, ghost stories, basically. Remarkable tempests in New England, another chapter on strange weather in New England. Remarkable judgments, which chronicles the tales of people who met with the consequences of their sins. And on like that. There's a chapter on deaf and dumb persons, which doesn't seem to fit the rest of the book. There are stories about sudden deaths, drunkards who died, ill fortunes that befell people who caused trouble in the churches, and things like that. In fact, let me give you two samples. I'll read straight from the book. Increase Mather writes this, quote, "It hath been by many observed that men addicted to horrid cursings and execrations have pulled down the imprecated vengeance of heaven upon themselves." So in other words, he's saying people who have a tendency to curse end up calling down imprecations from heaven on themselves, vengeance. Sundry very awful examples of this kind have lately happened. He says, I shall here mention one or two. So here's one. The hand of God was very remarkable in that which came to pass in the Narragansett country in New England, not many weeks since, for I have good information that on August 28, 1683, a man there named Samuel Wilson, having caused his dog to mischief of his neighbor's cattle, was blamed for his so doing. The way he writes is a little bit hard to follow, and it's verbose. But he's saying, okay, this guy was accused of causing his dog to trouble the cattle of his neighbor. He denied the fact with imprecations, meaning he denied it and swore, bad language, wishing that he might never stir from that place if he had so done. So he swears that he's telling the truth, and he says, if I'm not telling the truth, may I never move from this place. His neighbor, being troubled at his denying the truth, reproved him and told him he did very ill to deny what his conscience knew to be the truth. The atheist, thereupon, used the name of God in his imprecations, saying he wished to God he might never stir out of that place if he had done that which he was charged with. And Increase says, the words were scarce out of his mouth before he sunk down dead and never stirred more, a son-in-law of his standing by and catching him as he fell to the ground. So, don't invoke the name of God if you're lying. But he continues, a thing not unlike this happened, though not in New England, in America, about a year ago. For in September 1682, a man at the Isle of Providence, belonging to a vessel whereof one man named Woolery was master, being charged with some deceit in a matter that had been committed to him, in order to his own vindication, horridly wished that the devil might put out his eyes if he had done as was suspected concerning him. He says, that very night, an infection with a heavy mucus discharge fell into his eyes, so that within a few days he became stark blind, his company being astonished at the divine hand which thus conspicuously and signally appeared, put him ashore at Providence and left him there. A physician, being desired to undertake his cure, hearing how he came to lose his sight, refused to meddle with him. So, I don't know if those stories are true or not. You notice they do have some of the characteristics of urban legends today. They're hearsay. They're based on stories he heard from people he knows. You hear a lot of things like that today, and we've learned from the way these things spread on the internet, you don't necessarily have to take these at face value. This is not inspired truth. It's not like Scripture. So you wonder, did this really happen, or is someone exaggerating? I don't know. But he goes on to tell the story of a 5-year-old girl who he says were playing with other children under a cart when an iron hinge, being sharp at the lower end, happened to strike her head between the right ear and the crown of her head and pierced into the skull and brain. The child making an outcry, the mother came and immediately drew out the iron, and thereupon some of the brains of her child, which stuck to the iron, and other bits were scattered on her forehead. And he goes on and describes in the most graphic, stomach-turning detail what the doctors did to treat this horrific wound, which you would think from his description ought to have been fatal, right? I mean, this pierced her skull and damaged her brain. But the girl survived and recovered, and he says she had no adverse effect other than, this was the part that captured my attention. She had a strange hole in her skull, and Increase Mather says that this wound would bulge or sink in with the changing of the tide. These are his words. When it was springtide, he says, her brain would heave up the tender skin and fill in the place sometimes. When it was nip tide, that's lower tide, her brains would be sunk and fallen within the skull. And he ends the anecdote by saying, this child lived to be the mother of 2 children, and, which is marvelous, he said, she was not by this wound made defective in her memory or her understanding. So again, it's fascinating stuff to read, lots of tales like that, and I'm guessing Ripley read books like this and borrowed some of their stories for his comic strip. But the goal of the Mathers was not to entertain. They believed not only that it was important to record these remarkable displays of divine providence, but also they believed that by paying attention to the outworking of divine providence, they could discern lessons and truths that were unique to their circumstances. They believed even that God was basically speaking to New England, to the believers in New England, through acts of providence. And the reason they collected these stories is they believed that if we listen closely to what providence is saying or suggesting, we can discern the message God has for us in it. And they were not alone in that belief, certainly. Many of the Puritans sought to discern the will of God by trying to make sense of what providence dealt them. And in fact, at the start of his book, Increase Mather indicates that it was actually the famous Puritan commentator, Matthew Poole. You may have heard of him. His voluminous commentary on the whole Bible is still available and still worth reading. Matthew Poole, he says, was the one who first proposed the recording of these remarkable providences. Let's note the strange things and unusual things that happen all around us, write them down, and maybe we can make sense of what message God is trying to send us. I think that's a dangerous way to think. I don't think we're supposed to be interpreters of God's providence. And in fact, the error that underlies projects like this, I think, is the notion that we can, dogmatically and accurately interpret providential events and thereby get a window into the mind and the will of God simply by recording and interpreting remarkable happenings. So that if something bad happened, they judged that this looks like God's judgment. But if you think of that in light of the story of Job in the Old Testament, Job's counselors were bad counselors precisely because they assumed they could read the mind of God simply by observing what providence was playing out. The problem was that Job's experiences looked, from the human perspective, like divine judgment. But we know from the story of Job that these were actually Satan's attacks. Job's counselors had no way of knowing, and so they were wrong to draw the conclusions they drew. And likewise with the Puritans of New England. They were too prone to think they could understand the meaning behind the workings of divine providence. And in fact, at one point, when a series of unusual misfortunes and natural disasters and calamities like the witchcraft trials had a string of these bad things had happened in New England, Cotton Mather concluded that the Lord was displeased with the churches in the colony. And in order to explain his conclusion on this, one of the things he cited, one of his books written after 1992, trying to explain the witchcraft episode, he observed that nearly every time lightning would strike in New England, it would hit the church rather than any other building. And he saw that as evidence that God is displeased with the churches. And you know that it was just one generation after Cotton Mather's time when another Bostonian, someone who'd grown up in Boston, Ben Franklin, would figure out and explain why it was that New England churches with their tall steeples were struck by lightning. Those steeples were like lightning rods. So this was actually more of a mercy than it was a judgment, but they misread it. And in fact, in one place early on, Cotton Mather seemed dogmatic in suggesting that all these lightning strikes that hit churches might be evidence of God's displeasure or a threat of judgment for wayward Christians or whatever. But then just a few years later, in one of his sermons, he again observed, and quoting him, these are his words, that thunders break out oftener on churches rather than any other houses, but now he suggests this is because the demons have a particular spite at houses that are set apart for the peculiar service of God. So he went from concluding that the lightning strikes were a sign of divine judgment to saying, no, maybe this is a sign that the devil's angry with us. The truth is, he didn't have any way of knowing infallibly what it meant when lightning hit a church. And I suspect that Mather came to realize he wasn't a reliable interpreter of the meaning or the message behind divine providence, because he had a tendency to make predictions early on in his life, and many of his predictions proved to be wrong. He lived long enough to see a lot of his predictions fail, and so he grew less self-assured with these kinds of judgments the older he got, which is a good thing. But here's a lesson for us. We may not know the meaning of every blight or blessing that divine providence sends our way, but if you're a believer who knows and loves the Lord, you can be certain that God's purpose is good, because we know, don't we, that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are the called according to his purpose. That's Romans 8:38. We'll talk about that in the next hour. I'm going to stop there for now. We still have 10 minutes, but I want to continue this lecture tonight, and we'll talk about some of Cotton Mather's strange medical ideas. I want to start with that and share with you some interesting pages from his medical manual, and how, despite the fact that a lot of his suggested medical remedies are laughable today, he actually became one of the truly great heroes of American medical history. So we'll talk about tonight the witchcraft episode, how Cotton Mather as a young man overcame a serious speech impediment, and several other things like that. So if you really want to know and understand Cotton Mather and what drove him, you're going to want to hear that other part of the study tonight, so be sure to come tonight. For now, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yes?
How did Increase and Cotton tie together providence or divine providence and witchcraft? I'm not.
So the question is, how do they tie together divine providence and witchcraft? Well, I think they saw everything that happens as an expression of, because that's what we've been talking about this week. It's true that nothing happens apart from God's providential control and suggestion. So when the witchcraft episode broke out, and we'll talk about this a bit tonight, it was a couple of young girls who were actually experimenting with some occult methods of fortune telling, who became, I don't want to say definitively that they were demon-possessed, but they began to manifest these strange behaviors and strange afflictions, and they claimed that they had been bewitched, that someone in the community was a witch, and they began to accuse people. And historians suggest that there were some factions in the churches, people who weren't getting along with their neighbors and things like that. And they used the witchcraft hysteria to accuse one another. And it sort of all broke out like that. But Mather, Cotton Mather in particular, when the witchcraft episode broke out, Increase was in England on business. And so Cotton was left to try to adjudicate this thing himself, or at least advise the judges who were trying people for witchcraft. And I think he was more interested in the strange phenomena, the behaviors that made these girls look like they were possessed or bewitched. And yeah. Yes. Well, like I said, his view, he was very Calvinistic. All of the Puritans were. So they would have believed, I think correctly, that nothing happens apart from the providence of God. So everything that happens, God has a purpose in it. It doesn't mean he approves of evil. So at the same time, they're recognizing that there's a reason witchcraft has broken out in New England. It's because of the sins of our community. But at the same time, they're not endorsing, obviously, the witchcraft. They thought the source of this was evil. This is the devil set loose in our community. And they were eager to stop it. And things went bad from there. We'll talk about it a bit tonight. But yes, Chris.
What is your opinion about the Puritan reports of demon possession, where they, just like some of the other things, exaggerations, perhaps conscious exaggerations, but the reformed world, as you are likely
Yeah, I think it's dangerous, and it's one of the lessons we learned from the Mather's approach to trying to interpret divine providence. It's dangerous to read too much into any phenomenon or draw conclusions about this or that. And I can't really judge, reading something that sounds like an urban legend, I don't know whether that was true or not. I do believe, based on what Scripture tells us, that Satan has the ability to make things that look supernatural happen, to fake miracles. I mean, the magicians of Egypt were able to fake miracles that fooled people pretty well in Moses' time, and Satan himself is a supernatural being, so I think he has powers that I don't know what the limits of his powers are. But if you read the accounts of what happened in Salem Village, there are credible, let me say this, there are reports from people who you would think would be credible, educated people, judges, people who were at first skeptical of the witchcraft, who claimed that remarkable things were happening in the courtroom. And you could go to the museum in Salem today, there are needles, pins, like sewing elements that eyewitnesses at the time claimed they saw these things bend without anyone touching them. And so you get these bent pins in little boxes you can see in the thing today. Whether that happened or not, I don't know. I don't think it's important. I think it's clear, though, that Satan was definitely working in this thing. It cost people their lives. It was definitely an outbreak of evil. Whether the phenomenon were, like sleight of hand tricks or really preternatural things happening, I don't know, and I don't know if it's important to know. What? Yeah, and I think a lot of people in ministry, including myself, have encountered people who I'm convinced were demon-possessed. They had otherworldly voices speaking out of their throats and things like that. I do believe things like that definitely happen, that there are supernatural phenomena. I don't want to read too much in it or make too much about it or become too interested in it, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. I don't think we're supposed to be living in fear of Satan and satanic attacks. And when people do embrace that kind of superstition, what you get is the sort of disaster that happened in Salem Village in 1692. So yeah, I don't know what happened, but it's clear that this was a satanic attack. It was an outbreak of evil in Salem Village. And how many of the stories are to be taken at face value or doubted, I don't know. But I also think that Satan, he plays to our superstitions, so that the more you are gullible, the more strange phenomena you're going to see, because Satan is going to use his trickery to play to your fears and superstitions, which is why I think it's not healthy to become overly interested in those kinds of things.
It seems that they forget about the New Testament as far as the witchcraft goes, because that's the way that they want to do it. That would be to proclaim the gospel, and also were they all pretty much theonomous individuals at that time?
It's an anachronism to suggest that they were theonomists. I said something like that, but it's partly facetious. A lot of their ideas are echoed by today's theonomists. But yes, I think they had a tendency to blend the religion of the church too much with the politics of Caesar. They didn't clearly distinguish between that which belongs to Caesar and that which belongs to God. And that's part of the fault of a lot of the early reformers. One of the reasons early Geneva has a bad reputation among scholars is I think they did blend church and state too much. And the Puritans carried that fault a bit too. Did they forget about the New Testament? I'd say the answer to that is definitively not. They understood, and to these bewitched girls, they preached the gospel. But they also believed that witchcraft was real, and if someone was dabbling with witchcraft, the proper and just thing to do would be to put that person to death. That's what the Old Testament calls for. And the New Testament doesn't really change justice in the sense that obviates that Old Testament law. But yeah, one of the things, I get your point, and I think it's true that one of the things that provoked them to apply the Old Testament penalties to sins like witchcraft was their theonomic leaning, let's say. That they didn't always distinguish clearly between the moral, civil, and ceremonial aspects of the law. Well, that's the hard buzzer. We have to stop, right? So we'll finish this tonight.